This is an oral history interview with Jackie Kersh. The interviewer is Betty Brady, a longtime friend and fellow volunteer at the West Volusia Historical Society. Today is Monday, April 24th, 2023. The interview is being recorded at the Historical Society's Conrad Research Center in DeLand, Florida. Jackie, I know you're a Florida native.
And I'm proud of it, although there are times when I'm more so than others. But yes, my mother and father were from Georgia and Alabama, respectively. But they met in Orlando and married and honeymooned at Lake Windermere. And I was born in Jacksonville several years later. And I lived in Florida until actually I graduated from high school. I don't think I had ever been out of the state of Florida till I graduated from high school.
Was it always in Jacksonville?
No. We lived in, this was the Depression time. I was born at the depth of the Depression. And Dad lost a very good job and never was able to get back in his profession again. So we lived in a bunch of small towns and wherever he could find a job. And finally wound up I went to junior high school in Palatka and then graduated from Mainland High School in Daytona Beach when it was still the old building over on the middle of town. But it was a very different Florida from what we know today. Yes, it was a tourist state, but we had very, by the time I was an adult, I would say graduated from high school, that's sort of, I thought I was an adult. We had some very good public officials who really tried to keep Florida in the middle lane and not take off in any direction, because that was a very turbulent time.
And where did you go to college?
University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And that was the first time that I was out of the state of Florida, at least for any length of time. Mother and I went up on the bus to Knoxville and stopped in Georgia to see all of her McRae relatives. And I met all these people who were first cousins and double first cousins, and they were all just really nice people that I didn't really know at all. But it was interesting, and that was the first time that I really had any contact with family outside of my parents. I was an only child. They lost a child before me, and I was it. And so we just never had a lot of, I know my grandparents on either side. So it was a very tight family unit for us.
And what did you study?
Journalism. My father had been an advertising man. He would like for me to have gone into advertising, and I really didn't want to do that. My teachers at Mainland wanted me to go into speech and theater because I was active in the Forensic Society. And I didn't want to do that. I knew I didn't want to teach. And so I landed on journalism. And at that time, it was just a department inside the business administration college. So I had to take all math and all sort of things that were not my favorite subjects because I was in business. But it was a good school. I learned a lot, and it was not nearly as big as it is now. Tennessee has an interesting education system for higher ed. It's all one university. It's the University of Tennessee, but campuses, at Knoxville, or at Memphis, or at Nashville, or so forth. And so it was this big behemoth, but the systems administration was based on the Knoxville campus, so we got the benefit of all that.
And that's where you were.
Yes.
And then after that, where'd you go? What'd you do? You worked
Came back to Florida. My parents had moved to Tennessee with me in order to afford for me to go to an outside state school. And so they wanted to come back to Florida. And I didn't see any reason not to come back to Florida. I really had no job counseling or anything like that at that time. So I put in an application at the News Journal because they were planning to come back to Daytona. And then I also had been working in the summers and on holidays with JCPenney in Knoxville, and they gave me a very good recommendation and said, just go in our store when you get back to Daytona. They'll probably have a job for you. And so I went for an interview with the News Journal, and it didn't strike me that they were particularly interested in me. So I went on over to the JCPenney store and had a conversation with them, and I was offered a job at JCPenney. And then I went home, and people said, did you know the News Journal is advertising for you on the radio?
Really?
And I said, what? So, as it turned out, I had not left them any contact information. And they wanted to hire me. So I gave up my job at Penny's and went to work for Herbert Davidson was the editor at that time, and Julius Davidson was the publisher. And there were two newspapers, the morning paper and the evening paper. And I worked for the morning paper, which meant I worked at night. And got to trail along when I was assigned to the women's department, as you usually are at a newspaper, particularly at that time. And but I got to ride along with the police reporters and people of that up in, really in news. And so I got a good taste of what journalism was like. It was a great newspaper at that time.
You didn't stay in journalism, though. You
No.
wandered into...
I just decided that I preferred saying good things about people instead of building up conflict, and it seemed like that was where we were at that particular time in journalism. And
what year would that have been, approximately?
I was at the News Journal, I think, about 2 years. But I'm not real clear. I don't remember the exact time span, but it was about 2 years. And still in the women's department, going to the yacht club and covering luncheons, and getting sent out every time they planted a palm tree anywhere in Daytona, because the Davidsons loved palm trees. But anyway, I finally answered an advertisement for the National Methodist Church, they had a radio and film commission which produced films for the whole church in Nashville, Tennessee. And they were looking for someone to help with promotion for the first television series that they had ever produced. And I got the job, and I moved back to Tennessee. And from then on, I was back and forth mostly in Tennessee, and then back to Florida. I left Trafco about 3 years later, and
That's the television?
Yes,
Okay.
Television, Radio, and Film Commission. Mm-hmm. And at that time, Nashville was one of the three centers of Methodism. The others were Chicago and Washington, D.C. And I had a chance to go to Washington with the man who had been the head of the Methodist Publishing House in Nashville, but he was moving to head the Board of Temperance, which later became the Board of Social Concerns in Washington. And he was the person that everybody who was in any kind of communication in the Methodist Church wanted to work with.
And you were moving to the center of power.
Yes, yes. So anyway, I hated Washington.
Okay.
It took me a year to get out of there.
And where'd you go?
Back to Florida, to a weekly newspaper in Wauchula, and I stayed there for about 5 years, and that was a really good time for me. I learned journalism from the bottom up, and I learned local issues. I became an environmentalist for the first time.
You didn't get stuck on the woman's page.
No, I did not. I was assistant editor.
Yay.
And I wrote a column. But it was a great little small town newspaper. And from there, I got a chance to be the first public information officer for Hillsborough County Schools. That was in the latter stages of busing for integration, and that was a really tough time. We also had the first statewide teacher strike, only statewide teacher strike, thank goodness, in Florida during that time. And after about 5 years, I was just worn out. That's the hardest job I've ever had. And I moved to the State Department of Education because the former superintendent at Pinellas County, neighboring St. Petersburg, had become the State Commissioner of Education. And I was there for a couple of years. And then that was the political campaign when Roy Collins, who had been governor of Florida during the hardest part of the integration period and was really responsible for keeping Florida from going off the cliff, ran for senator and lost. And at that, I was just devastated. And I got a chance to go back to Tennessee, to the university, with an extension agency that worked with all the cities, actually. We mainly worked with the myriad of small cities that Tennessee had, doing things that they couldn't afford to have full-time staff for. And I was doing public information. I was there for, I can't believe it, 17 years.
17 years.
And then I wanted to come back to Florida. My father really wanted to come back to Florida. And so Stetson offered me the public relations job at Stetson and came back to Florida.
That's how I was going to ask how you got to DeLand.
Yep, that's how I got to DeLand.
Okay. So you came here to head up Stetson's PR department.
Yes.
And how then did you get involved with working for the West Volusia Historical Society?
Initially because it was my job. Stetson at that time was going through kind of a refocusing. This was the beginning of their effort to, and this really doesn't relate to the society as much as what I was initially doing at Stetson. But they were getting ready to make the break with the Florida Baptist Convention and change to an independent university.
This was in the late 80s?
Yes. I came down to interview in November of '86, and it was one of those gorgeous November days, and landed at the airport in Daytona on the tarmac, and you walk down the little steps and the sun was shining, and I had left Knoxville in the rain, and I would have paid Stetson to hire me.
Well, I hope you didn't tell them that.
No, I didn't. I took a big pay cut, but I really did want to do that. But anyway, but I think they hired me because I had worked for the Methodist Church, and I understood working with denominations. It didn't mean I understood Baptists, because I didn't.
That's a different structure.
That is very different. But I did understand how church politics works and so forth. So then we had a fraternity incident, and they were also the city and the county were going through developing what they called a master growth plan for the area. And over that, they had an education overlay, which we were trying to develop for Stetson to protect us as much as possible. And then over that, they were doing a historic overlay, which also affected us. And so there was a parallel movement about that time, although I think it's been ongoing forever, to widen Woodland Boulevard through the Stetson campus.
4 lanes?
4 lanes through the Stetson campus. And that would have been absolute death for Stetson. I would sit up in my office window, which was across the street from the campus, in the oldest house on campus, and watch students run across 2 lanes of Woodland Boulevard with their choir robes flapping and carrying their cello and whatever. And it would have just been disaster. And so we had a architect here developing what we called a master campus plan, and also a well-known builder, particularly a restoration builder. He was the architect who was pretty well, that was Ken Smith from Jacksonville. He had done Princess Place and the lighthouse at St. Augustine and a lot of very well-known restorations. He was the leading restoration architect in Florida at that time. And so he was doing the master plan. Part of that master plan was to close Amelia Avenue through the campus. And that had already kicked up a big ruckus. And now we were faced with them 4-laning Woodland Boulevard. So experts had told us that 2 things, at least, that the state really hated, particularly the State Road Transportation Department, really hated when they were doing a expansion project. Number 1, trees. They really, really hated to have to move trees. The other one was historic districts. Historic buildings are historic districts. Well, historic buildings were Stetson's stock in trade. that proved our stability.
The land house would have been in the way.
That's for sure. The president's house would have been in the way.
I misspoke. I meant where the president's office is.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
Elizabeth Hall would have been right on the curb. But anyway, so we were advised to do whatever we could with trees, which have history, because Woodland Boulevard was named because it had trees on both sides and down the middle at one time. The trees had gone that used to line Woodland Boulevard. So we had a donor who owned a large wholesale nursery who offered us as many live oaks as we wanted.
Big live oaks.
Big live oaks. And we planted them back. We planted the boulevard on both sides. The ones you see out there now are the trees that Doug Lee planted as president, and he always said that was the greatest thing he ever did for Stetson. But
when I drive under them, I think the same thing.
I do too. But then we also started pursuing a historic district. DeLand Hall was already on the National Register. It had gone on during the centennial. But the campus as a whole it was a very compact campus. It had been designed, and the bulk of it had been designed and built by the same architect builder. And we did not think that it would be difficult to get a district. And at that time, Sidney Johnston, who has since become a part of the Stetson family, was working for a historic survey company in St. Augustine. That was kind of a golden time for preservation in Florida. There were national and state grants available to do surveys and to do reconstruction or renovation. And so Sidney did the survey of both the Stetson campus and that adjoining area from Minnesota and over to Michigan that's now known as the Northwest Residential District, because they were connected because so many different Stetson professors had lived in that area. Lincoln Hulley's widow lived in that area and so forth. So I guess they thought I didn't have enough to do. And so I got drafted to administer that grant when we got it from the state to do the survey. And I was also looking around for groups that might share our concern about woodland and would be willing to help us defeat this project. And of course, one of them was the Historical Society. But I had already met, I'm talking about in the early 90s now, but I had already met Bill Driggers in less pleasant circumstances in 1988 when they decided to, they had moved the old City Hall from on Rich Avenue, which was a little one-story bungalow-looking place.
Was it the first City Hall?
First City Hall, built in 1890, I think. And the city wanted that lot for something, so Stetson agreed that they could move it over to a corner of the Stetson campus, which we were not using at that time. But Doug had a real project going to protect the campus on all sides as much as he could by acquiring land, clearing other extraneous things off so that we had it for expansion. It was a very landlocked campus. And so Pope Duggan, the previous president, had first offered the old City Hall to the Historical Society for an office and small museum. And for 2 years, they were trying to figure out a way to move it, pay for moving it, find a lot to move it on. And the city was cooperating in this. And finally, though, Stetson stepped in and did get an estimate of the cost of moving it, and found that it was exorbitant, plus the mover said that the building would not stand up to being moved.
Oh.
And certainly the Historical Society at that time could not afford to pay for what it would cost. And they also had not been able to come up with a lot that was really acceptable and to move it to. And about that same time, David Disney, who was then on the city commission, heard about a building on Michigan Avenue that could be purchased and restored. And he proposed that the city, that he said he had a donor, that was it. He had a donor who was willing to buy that building and help with the restoration if the city would then take it over and operate it and pledge that it would be the perpetual home of the West Volusia Historical Society. And that was what later became DeLand House. And the city hall was left sitting over on the corner of Amelia and Michigan until it was demolished. And I got to try to talk Bill out of trying to restore it and keep it there on the corner. And I got sent over to take pictures of everything in that building before it was demolished. So I have good memories of Bill, but I have some sort of dicey memories too. But I was not really affiliated with the society until we began to move into that. I came over and helped some with DeLand House.
Now that donor was Hortense and Robert Conrad. Was it David Disney who found them, or was it Bill?
I don't know exactly how the story goes that he came rushing into a meeting of the city commission and said, wait, about the city hall. And the city manager was trying to decide what they were going to do about it. And said, wait, I've got
the better
idea. And, but he was certainly instrumental in bringing the society and the city and the Conrads together.
Okay. So they took charge of DeLand House and renovated it. And at what point did you become involved?
I was involved a little bit in the restoration, partly because my father, who was living with me at that time, was a do-it-yourselfer, and he had run out of do-it-yourself projects at our house. And I thought maybe that he might be interested in, because that work was almost all done in DeLand House by volunteers. Okay. We have this great picture of Bill sitting on the floor with doorknobs spread out all around him, cleaning paint off of doorknobs.
I've seen a picture of you with a paint roller in your hand.
Well, I didn't actually paint. I got drafted to climb up on a ladder, and I'm scared to death of heights, to climb up on a ladder and try to peel the layers of wallpaper that was covering some beautiful paneling in the entrance to DeLand House. But I was not one of the real builders that worked on that project. Bill was certainly instrumental in getting that done. Bill was a wonderful fundraiser. We've just never had anybody like him. He could walk into, he belonged to a lot of organizations, and he could walk into a club and say, we're doing this, and this is why we need it, and we need $200 or whatever. And they'd write the check. We just never had anybody like that before or since.
What about state grants? Could he get those too?
Yes, we were, as I say, that was kind of a golden period for preservation. And I don't want to get political here, but there were Democrats in power, and both here and in Washington. And so there was this money available if you were willing to match it. And we had a real friend in Tallahassee, in the then Secretary of State, Jim Smith, who was, I believe, Secretary of State, both at the time that we did the land house and later when we did the conversion of the old hospital on Stone Street.
Okay.
But I can't take credit for what turned into the land house.
Well, Bill Driggers was certainly the face of the society for a long time.
Yes.
He was Henry DeLand, and everybody knew him. He spoke widely, went into the schools.
Yes.
Everybody knew Bill.
Yes. And we would not have the information about the area that we have now if it had not been for first the 3 history books that Bill and other members of the society wrote and E.O. Painter printed.
And that was, at least one of those, I don't know the timing, was before they had the land house, correct?
Yes. Volusia, the west side, was before they got the land house. That
Okay.
was while they were just in the kind of formative stages. And that's the heart of what we now call the Driggers collection of historic West Volusia pictures. Were the pictures that Bill had collected, inherited from his father, and then collected himself, and then pictures that they went out and solicited from families and groups for those 3 histories.
He was a 4th generation West Volusian. He knew everybody.
He was.
He probably knew all their secrets.
He did. He knew a lot of them.
Okay.
Bill could be very diplomatic.
Okay. I think you told me once that you finally became more involved with the Historical Society over a home tour?
Yes. Everyone sort of takes the home tour for granted now. It is the thing that the society, I think, is known for in this area. Tour of historic homes at Christmas time. But the first tour, I believe, was in 1993, which was the first tour we were not involved with. It was a run out of the DeLand Women's Club, but the wife of the then president, Harold Correll, her name was Amy Correll, was also a very active member of the Women's Club. And so she contributed to that tour, and then it was so much work until they decided that they needed more than one organization involved in it. And the society actually ran the second tour, and by the 3rd tour we were doing it completely within the society. It was done every year at that time, and it was the sure big money maker for the society. As grants kind of began to disappear, the home tour became even more important. And I think I worked in every home tour except the first one, except for maybe a couple right after I first retired from Stetson when I was traveling. But we had it was an amazing thing, because remember, we do it now every other year and think it's a real bear. And then we were doing it every year. But I think the reason that it was so successful was it was designed by a little dynamo woman named Lorena Hare. I want to be sure to mention Lorena, who chaired several home tours in those early years. And it was designed to be kind of self-continuing, perpetuating. If you were new to the society, your first job would be as a docent in a house for the home tour. And if you didn't completely lose your mind at that point, you were recruited for a home tour committee. And you finished one home tour, and the tour committee started meeting for the next home tour.
Wow.
And so it was very much a cyclical thing, and there were no last minute, well, there could be last minute surprises, but we had both a chair and a general chair and a vice chair. And that's the only time I ever served as chair of the home tour. I managed to avoid it the rest of the time. But I was vice chair one year when the president who was actually the chair at that time, became ill and couldn't go on with it. But we started recruiting for docents almost as soon as the last tour was over. And for years, I did serve as the volunteer recruiter for the home tour.
A very big job.
Which was a pain, but it was a very necessary one. But the home tour we just accept it as being something now. But at the time, it was a real kind of miracle.
I remember you used to get really good publicity.
Oh, yes.
The Sun News ran a full spread, the Sentinel ran a spread.
The Sentinel used to run at the weekend before the home tour. They would run a full page with photographs of the pictures of the homes that were on the tour. But the media is different now.
It certainly is. It certainly is. You said that you took a break for a while after you retired?
Yes. My mother died at 65, and her family was not a particularly long-lived family. My father lived to almost 95, and at one time, one of his aunts was the oldest woman in Alabama. So the Kersh family was pretty long-lived, but I really didn't know which one I had inherited. And I found that I could retire at 65, mostly because of all the years I spent at the University of Tennessee. And so I decided to do that, and there were some changes at Stetson that I was not particularly enthusiastic about trying to follow through on. And so I just decided to retire, and I had a long to-do list, bucket list or whatever. And so for about 5 or 10 years, I traveled a lot.
So you kept yourself free to go, and you went.
Yes,
That
I
sounds
did.
like a great plan. But you rejoined the board eventually.
Yes. The last time was in 2014 when the society was having kind of a downtime. And no, let me back up. Earlier than that, I was active with the society around 2000, 2008, in that period. That was where we did the restoration workshop, which I still consider the best thing I've ever done. But it drew people from all over the state and even from out of state. And to we kept it intentionally at 25, and started off we started with a speaker and dinner on Friday night, and then a full day on Saturday. And what made it so really, I think, popular was that we borrowed from the home tour in a sense. We did on-site workshops in houses buildings that were being restored.
So this was designed to show people who wanted to restore old houses how to do it and give them practical.
Right. Not so much how to do it in terms of doing it themselves, but all of the issues they were going to have to deal with. You know, how are you going to be your own contractor and then hire subcontractors? How do you find a roofer that knows how to do a historic roof? how do you find a historic carpenter? We happen to have some very good ones in this area, and they, like George Jenkins, that would come in and talk to them. And then we expanded to insurance agents on how much of your house can you insure, what do you have to do, does we found out it has to have under Florida law, it has to have the underpinnings enclosed. And a lot of older houses are built up on piers, so they had to close that somehow. And how to get grants if you're going to try, what grants are available and how to get them. We had a wonderful architect who had just moved here from South America he had built hotels in South America, but he was interested in bungalows, and he restored a bungalow here and then just fell in love with old houses. That was Hernando Gomez. And Hernando just gave so generously of his time and charged us nothing. He later came on our board for a while, and that was great too. And then we had Bob and Karen Ryder Wetton, who were, I don't even know how many houses they had restored. And they were experts. And
he was president at one time.
Yes, he was president several times.
Okay.
And, but anyway, it was designed to help people, number one, realize what they're taking on, because it's not easy to restore an old building. And what's the difference between restoring and remodeling, as they used to call it, which a lot of people unfortunately did. And nobody else was doing anything like that in the area at that time. So it ran for about 4 years.
I seem to recall that you used to have people coming from all over Florida to attend.
They did.
It was a big draw.
In fact, the first workshop we did, the night dinner plus speaker, the speaker for that first dinner was Kenneth Smith, the restoration architect. And then they had field visits the next day on Saturday. We later expanded to Saturday and Sunday, but they still we always closed with those site visits because they were so popular.
Did the field guide that you oversaw the compilation of to DeLand buildings, did that grow out of this?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. It was, I saw a field guide to historic buildings in Nova Scotia and thought, why don't we have something like that? And so Hernando was very interested in it. The Wettons were very interested in it. Karen wrote a lot of the forward and the back, the appendix, the kind of how to use this, so forth. And we eventually had, most of the people who worked on the field guide had worked in the workshop.
Okay. I remember another area that we used to do about that time with gardening, heirloom gardening.
That was a little bit later. That was starting in 2014.
Okay.
Bob agreed to take the presidency again, and the society was going through some difficulties. We had expanded Conrad Center and with an ECHO grant, but we underestimated how much it was going to cost, and we were only able to do the project by borrowing from reserves. That was okay. That's what the bill said, that's what the reserves are for. But the idea was that we would borrow from them, but then we would replace the reserves. And for whatever reason, those reserves were not replaced. And the society came up to a year when they were really in, we joked about they're probably going to turn the lights off tomorrow. But anyway, I rejoined the board at that time because Bob was looking for some board members, and he particularly wanted somebody to do marketing and possibly develop a fundraising plan. And I did that reluctantly because I hate marketing and I hate fundraising. But it was sort of necessary. And so that we began to look around for some other kinds of programming. Incidentally, I should say, the society is amazing in terms of programming. I have never seen a group that depends entirely on volunteers and has a rather small core of working volunteers that does as much as this group does. They do workshops, they do lectures, they do home tours, they do cemetery walks, and they run 2 museums, and it's just amazing. But we really needed to find some more things that would not necessarily bring in the big money like the home tour, but that would bring, each thing would bring something, plus they might attract more working volunteers. And so we came up with the idea of something called the special interest groups, and thinking that, yes, people say they like history, but usually they like some aspect of history. They love old houses, or they love heirloom gardens, or they want to write a book, research a book, or I came to the society through family research. I got bitten by the bug, and then I discovered that the same thing you do for family research, you do for any other historic research, but particularly old houses. But we wanted some kind of activity for each of those that would draw people into, broaden our reach, draw people into the society, and make a little money. And the Heirloom Garden Workshop was one of those. And we had this wonderful person out at the Ag Extension Station. Her name is Linda Landrum, and she has moved now. We drove her away. We worked her so hard. But she ran the gardening workshops, and people would lend their gardens for people to. We did a butterfly garden one time out on Lake Winnimusette, and we did a house garden here on Michigan, and tied that one in with the house tour, which was also a restored house. But I was amazed at how popular it was.
I remember those. Those were fun.
They were fun. And they didn't cost much. But people would come from New Smyrna for those things. Mm-hmm. The New Smyrna Garden Club came over practically en masse one time. But gradually those kind of worked. We lost Linda, and we really didn't have anybody else to. That's what happens to a lot of our programs. We lose the person who's the real spark plug for it, wear them out or whatever. And so then we lose the activity.
Someone said the society will let you do anything as long as you do it.
That's correct. They will let you do anything you want to do as long as you do it. They've been very good at that.
Yeah. Was about the time we also started the Porch Chat and the Parlor Chat?
Yes. That was originally Bob Wetton's idea. He wanted to do something on the porches that would be sort of like the home tour, but not so elaborate. And so we came up with the idea of the Porch Chats, which actually turned out to be more of a bear than the home tour, because trying to organize small groups moving between various houses where reenactors were doing things on porches was not as simple as we first thought it was. But so we only did a couple of the 2 years, I think, and then we simplified it a little bit and moved it inside and called it the Parlor Chats, and those have proved to be very successful.
So these are reenactors who are portraying specific people
Yes.
and talking to one another.
The other thing the Society is really noted for are its reenactors. They have really brought local history alive for people. And I don't know what we will ever do if they decide they don't want to go out and turn actors.
Well, something we haven't talked about at all is your work over at the Stone Street Museum.
That one has always been a problem for the Society, partly because it isn't really our museum. It's owned by the city, as DeLand House is, but it's also operated by the city. We operate DeLand House. And so we make the city allows us to make the decisions about DeLand House that are necessary to have a successful museum. And we've always had problems with having docents over at Stone Street.
What's over there?
There are, I should mention Ora and Gilbert Seaworth. They used to play cards. They were winter visitors originally, and they played cards with Amy and Harold Corral. And one night, the hospital had closed, of course, many years ago. It was
the DeLand Memorial Hospital.
Yes, DeLand Memorial Hospital, which was the first building actually built for a hospital in this area, had closed and moved temporarily to the Naval Air Station Infirmary and then to Fish Hospital, Burt Fish Hospital, which was the dream come true for them. But then the school board was there for a number of years. That was their headquarters. And then finally the school board wanted to move, get rid of the property, and they couldn't find any other buyer, and the city bought it. And then with a lot of help from people like Secretary of State Jim Smith and Bill Driggers, Richard Graham, who was the representative at that time, and so the story goes, actually saved the project. The governor was set to cut it out of the budget because he didn't think it was as essential as some other things. And Richard Graham got it back in the budget. He had lived across the street from the hospital and sort of had a soft spot for it. But we had some great representatives. We had friends in Tallahassee and in Washington, and they were invaluable.
And Dr. Seaworth, he was a medical doctor?
Yes, he was an OBGYN, and Corral said, we're going to get involved in that building over there because Bill was chairman of the planning committee for the what to do with this building the city had then acquired. And Corral said, why don't you all think about doing some vintage hospital exhibits? So the Seaworth thought about it a while and decided, yeah, that might be interesting. Little did they know. And it became their life from then on. And Gilbert, we lost about a year ago. We still have Aura, thank goodness. But they developed a replica of the operating room which is set up for a cesarean operation
In the
because he was an OBGYN.
In the 1920s?
Yes, in the 1920s and early and 30s. And the hospital opened in 23, I believe, and closed in 47. But and they also did an apothecary exhibit to kind of show how medicine operated. Gilbert used to say if they gave people the stuff that was in those bottles, they were probably better off with whatever they had to start with. But anyway, then they did a replica of a doctor's office. Not that there was a doctor's office in the hospital, but that was where everybody was treated before there was a hospital. And so you see in the doctor's office things like treatment tables and things, so because that was it. Then later they acquired 2 iron lungs and did an exhibit on polio. And incidentally, the hospital had an iron lung. The Elks Club bought one for them, and in the late 40s. And then the society stepped in a number of years later, and in 2018, I think we opened it, and worked with the Alpha Kappa Alpha. I always misspeak that. Then I remember it's AKA. But that's a Black women's professional society. And we worked with them to redo the exhibits in the little building back of the hospital, of the main hospital, to better show Black medical care and life for Black people.
What was that originally?
That was what really got the whole thing on the National Register. It was the first Black hospital in West Volusia, in Volusia County, actually. Okay. There was one in Daytona in connection with Bethune-Cookman, but it was not yet open when ours opened in 31, I believe it was. But up until that time, Black people could be brought to the emergency room and treated, but then they were sent back to their doctor or back to their midwife and could not be admitted to the hospital, which would have been death for the very experienced, well-trained Black doctors that we were beginning to attract by then. Because if you couldn't admit a patient to the hospital, you were out of business as a doctor. And even though Black hospitals may have perpetuated segregation a little bit longer, they certainly saved the Black medical profession. But it is very, very rare for a community, and I think we know of only one other community in Florida that had the Black hospital and the white hospital on the same campus. This one is right behind. Unfortunately, the building that's there now is not the original building. It was designed by, the original building was designed by a well-known architect here, but it was built out of wood infrastructure and then stuccoed. And the termites had fun with it over the years, as they have many other buildings in this area. And when they started the restoration, they found it simply could not be rebuilt. And again, the Conrads stepped forward, this time Mrs. Conrad, and gave the money to rebuild on the same footprint, but not the same. We don't know what the configuration was inside. But
and that's called the Burgess Pavilion.
It's called the Burgess Pavilion. It's the Elizabeth Rowe Burgess Pavilion, named for a woman philanthropist from Minneapolis, I believe she was.
Another thing that the Society did early was, even early, before we had this capability of doing oral histories like this, is that they did interviews that were then transcribed with some of the old.
Yes, and I should mention that in 2014, when I came back in, the oral history program was practically dead, and we had had a very active one. There was a man and wife who developed it in the early years and had done a number of early people. Thank goodness Mary Lou Pfeffer got interested in it and revived it, and it is now flourishing, but it's one of the major programs that we have now.
Another thing the Society has done is the videos, which became DVDs, of Bill's programs, trying to preserve the knowledge that he had of Volusia.
Yes. Bill was what's known as a folk historian, and he did write books. He helped to produce books, but most of it, remember, he's a fourth generation Floridian. He knew Florida. His father worked for Florida Power Company when it was Del Pico, DeLand Power and Light. And
ice company.
Yes, Power and Ice Company, very important. And that's a whole different story I'm not going into. But yes, and he carried it all around in his head. He did these programs in schools. Initially, they were on just probably overhead projector, those
slide projector.
Not a slide projector, the kind you put just a piece of paper on and project it on the wall. I've forgotten what they call those things now. But anyway, and then the state helped him convert all of the pictures that they had collected with these 3 history books into a set of, I've forgotten how many sets. I went through all of them, so I ought to know how many sets there are of those slides, but it's up in the 30s, and converted them into slides, and so he could move to a slide program. And then the Society figured out how to convert those slides to video and produce the DVDs. But you're right, it was an effort to get out of Bill's head, while we still could, all the stuff that he knew.
Because he unfortunately is gone now.
He is gone.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's been no one else like him. Bill could be a pain in the neck sometimes, but he was the most, he knew things that nobody else knew, and he knew how to make history exciting and interesting for just the average person. You just can't replace him.
And for children. He worked in the schools.
Oh, he loved working with children.
Well, the Society is now celebrating its 50th anniversary. You've mentioned a lot of accomplishments. Is there anything we've left out, or things that you'd like to see it revive?
Not necessarily, but one thing that I didn't mention, and I really should, is that the Society never gets any credit for this, and I assume they don't really want credit, but they have been kind of the nurturing organization for many other historical groups in all over Volusia County.
Oh.
I know that...
They're not our competitors.
No, they're not our competitors. They address their particular area. We're West Volusia. We have tried to help some local cities. We worked with the Enterprise Association. We've worked with Orange City in developing their groups. We were very closely affiliated with the effort to open the African American Museum here in DeLand, and also in New Smyrna Beach. And for example, and it was not just informing organizations. When Ormond decided to do a home tour, they asked if some of our people would come over and tell them how to do a home tour. And we did. And we've done demonstrations at even state organizations on how to do a cemetery walk, which we do very well. And but it's kind of a silent nurturing that most people don't know, but we never have considered ourselves competitors.
People don't know a lot of things about the society.
No, they don't.
We are somewhat reluctant to do that, I guess.
Yeah, we sort of feel like that if we do good, people will know it.
Based on your experience as a volunteer, which has been amazing, and as a retiree volunteering, what would you tell somebody who's thinking about, I'd like to get involved, what can I do? Or I'm retired, now what?
I would say find an organization that does what you really love to do, that lets you follow your passion. And I would say that to young people as well. You know, if you're in high school and heavens above, you love history.
Come on down.
And a lot of, I think, the schools have started promoting students doing local family histories, so they get a feel for how to do research and that kind of thing. And I would certainly love to see a lot more younger people get involved in groups like this, because there's plenty of room for them. Those workshops that Karen Tweedy does in the reviving the old skills, the old crafts.
Sewing is an old
yes,
craft.
You can believe it.
That blew my mind.
How do you operate a sewing machine? Yes.
Okay.
Just get involved. There's always a place for you.